Okay, hello everyone. Happy Sunday and welcome to the first session of our first ever Indelible Festival of Literature. We want to give a massive thank you to all our sponsors, EBSCO, Nestle, and to the wonderful AUD community who helped make this happen. Just one thing before we start the session. I don't know if some of you may be familiar with the finger snapping during poetry readings. And since I would like to ask everybody to keep their mics muted, I would like to ask you to not forego the finger snapping. Keep doing it, but substitute it with the asterisk. So you might want to put the star sign in the chat box, and that would tell the poet and the rest of the audience that you are snapping your fingers. Because we know that oftentimes the poet would say something that would move us, touch us in a certain way, and we would like to react to it by snapping our fingers or cheering, which unfortunately we cannot do in this setup, but there's still something that we can do to make up for it. So, and for the clapping, you're all familiar by now with the emotional emojis here on Zoom, so you could use that. And again, you could also use the hash symbol for the clapping in the chat box. Okay, we've got a very exciting session for you tonight, starring an incredibly special poet who I know might dislike adverbs like really and incredibly, because adverbs are bossy words in poems, but well, it's not poetry yet, so I guess it's okay. Tonight, or this afternoon, or this morning, depending on where you're joining us from, I will be hosting Ruth Padel, award-winning poet in the UK. Ruth Padel has always loved singing, but she had also quietly played the viola too. Her latest poetry collection, Beethoven Variations, begins with her parents getting together playing music and follows her collection's Emeralds, mourning and celebrating her mother. Learning to make an oud in Nazareth about the divisions, but also the music of the Middle East, and Tidings, a Christmas journey, a narrative sequence inspired by Europe's most ancient musical form, the carol. She reads poems and talks about writing the life of one of the world's greatest creators and composers. Who is Ruth Padel? Again, she is an award-winning British poet and author that I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have heard about. She began life as a classicist studying ancient Greek and has spent much of her life in Greece, especially Crete. She is a passionate wildlife conservationist and also a musician. She now lives in London and has published 12 poetry collections, 7 nonfiction works, and a novel. Ruth is a fellow of both the Royal Society of Literature and Zoological Society of London, and professor of poetry at King's College London, where she hosts a popular series of poetry and events, combining poetry with other areas of life and learning. In July, she will publish her second novel, Daughters of the Labyrinth, set on Crete. So, Professor Ruth Padel, I have the honor of giving you the floor, and go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rula Maria, and hello everybody, wherever you are in this extraordinary world we find ourselves all in. I'm just going to start off with one poem, and then I will talk about it and talk about music, but this is about the faculty we have on which our ability to play music with each other depends. Listen. They say the ear bone, shaped like the bowl of a tiny spoon, lasts longest when we die. The soul might be like this, hard, necessary, almost nothing. My parents got together at a music camp in farmland of chalk hills. A clarinetist dropped out of the orchestra, and my dad, queued for the village payphone, called a girl he just met, hired a tandem bike, and fetched her from the station. I like to picture her on the edge of knowing, legs whizzing round, her clarinet case tied behind. He'd have done that for her. He always took great pains with making safe. Between hedgerows of early summer, she is cycling into a lifetime with him. Look, there we are, waiting for her. 5 future string players, hiding among the vetch and willow herb. She played the piano too. At first, she accompanied him in duets. I can see them working on Beethoven's Cello Sonata, Opus 69. She is listening to him. He's listening to her. Questions, answers, the all you can't say stream to and fro, angry, agonized, and tender as the history of marriage. Then we arrived, and she didn't have time to play. It gave me a notion women do their music making away from home. Later, she joined an orchestra. I remember her practicing trills from the Pastoral Symphony, where a clarinet alone has to drop perfect sound into perfect silence, suspend the world, then descend to the waiting ear. The almost nothing bone, that little house of hearing which brought the two of them together, and which Beethoven lost. So hard to discover and make perfect, even half perfect, in yourself. So when I started to write my Beethoven book, I had no plans really to include myself in it at all. I wanted to serve Beethoven and serve the reader by explaining, or not explaining, but disclosing what I found in his life to other people. But my editor said something interesting. She said, it's also his legacy. And I realized it's how Beethoven affects you, how he affects listeners, how his music affects us all. So I thought, well, because I have had a musical life of a quite intense kind. I was brought up playing the piano, first of all, and then the viola, which was also Beethoven's instrument. And we did quartets and string quintets in the family and outside. And I sang a lot of choirs. And I thought, maybe that's the way in, because music is something that affects us all. So that's what I did. It wasn't to sort of put myself forward so much as to use my own experience as a way of serving how we access Beethoven, why his life matters to us and his music. So here's one more poem. Most of the poems, of course, are about him and his music, but just a few of them are about me. And here's another one. My father got me, my brother, and my sister. I've got 2 more younger brothers. He made us, every Sunday, he made us play chamber music. Growing up with Beethoven. Sunday morning, my dad places crumbly sheets of music on the stands. For the first time, we are meeting Beethoven. My eldest brother with his cello, my sister on her violin, she must be 7 or 8, me on my viola. I'm mulish. I listen to Radio Luxembourg under the bedclothes at night. This music is inherited from grandfather, who had to sign a document in the First World War to say he wasn't German, though he mainly was. Whose father was a concert pianist taught by a pupil, a follower of Beethoven. When I go to stay, grandfather makes me play the piano blind, over velvet laid on the keys to keep them white. String trio, G major, Opus 9. First time I hear my viola's true, clear voice. More awkward for my stiff hand than the free bird singing in my throat, as if I were 2 beings, the soprano soaring upwards unafraid, and the shy voice of blending in. But I can see Beethoven has given each of us something different to say. mischief and hope. I like that. When we've stumbled through, our dad says, this melody reminded grandfather of sunlight on green mountains. Today, when I listen, I see my dad ahead on a mountain slope, stopping to look at a map or check out other mountains through the telescope. Now so many people I love have died, others lost in the wisps and fogs of Alzheimer's. I'd like to hold on to that, looking back to us three struggling with the notes and the other two listening, waiting their turn. Here we are still, the five of us, trying to get the counting right. So that's the sort of basis of me, really. And then I need to turn now with that to Beethoven himself. And I think the first thing that I did when I decided to do this book was to go to Bonn, to his birthplace. I started the book because I'd been doing work with the Indelible String Quartet, Britain's senior string quartet, which just this year has been disbanded. They were playing together 40 years, and I was privileged enough to work with them. So I would do poems about the quartets in between their quartets, and that's how the books on Beethoven really began. But then I went to his birthplace, Beethoven's birthplace, and from that I wrote this poem, which is really about the formation of his difficult at times, impulsive, angry, impatient, impetuous, grumpy personality, but also his astonishing creativity and musicianship. If your father damaged you, the way meteorites spin in, clustering on Antarctic ice, bare shields of glacier burnished by ferocious wind. Because your father is magnetite, dragging all the iron in your soul into his own force field. You seal yourself in. You need nothing but music. Your answer to obstruction will be fire. In the little hall of the house where you were born, the one original surface is dark silver flagstones where you might have crawled. Light falls in shallow hollows of deciduous rubbed stone, clogged with spume of cleaning fluid, where I imagine your mother carrying the shopping, your father staggering home drunk up these stairs, their new-cut wood now polished to the amber shine of a harvest moon, to wake you in the middle of the night, stand you for hours on a bench so you can reach the keys. You cry as you play, slapped if you make a mistake. In daylight, he hears you improvise, splashing around, he calls it, on a violin. What rubbish are you scratching now? Isn't that beautiful? No, you made it up. You're not to do that. Stop, or I'll box your ears. If your father damaged you, the way fierce winds scour glacier ice where meteorites have fallen from heaven. But he was the one who made you, beat the notes into you on the clavier, viola, violin. Your response to challenge ever after will be attack. You will need no one, only the relationship of sound and key. You improvise. So Beethoven's birthplace is in Bonn in Germany, and it was a revelation to go there. It's an extraordinary museum. It was a very musical town. It was an outpost of the Habsburg Empire, which was run from Vienna. And one of the minor Habsburgs usually ruled it. The Elector, he was called, and there was an Elector's palace. And Beethoven's grandfather had been the sort of impresario and conductor and director of the orchestra there. And his father was a singer and a violinist there. And his father realized, when the little boy was about 2 or 3, that he had a little genius on his hands, a musical genius. And he kind of hoped that he'd make his fortune and do a Mozart. He didn't manage that. And in a way, it was a sort of different genius. And he was differently culturally placed from Leopold Mozart, Mozart's father. Mozart was still alive when Beethoven was young. He died when Beethoven was about sort of 18, 16. But he taught him. But he was drunk and ruthless and did it very clumsily. And so I got very interested in how this burning desire to create and make music bedded down in the little boy, and he gradually he became very, very good at improvising. That's why I call the book Beethoven Variations, because improvising then was like jazz pianists these days. And it was as an improviser, a great piano improviser, that he went to Vienna. That was his ticket to Vienna. And there were improvising contests then, very showy things in private palaces where people, ladies with fans and men with wigs clapped as they listened to people improvising against each other. And he won all those. He was a ugly little provincial, badly dressed, from Germany with a rough Rhineland accent, and the Viennese all laughed at him and found him very ugly, but they found his improvising amazing. So I was just very struck that it was one of the things that we have recorded about what happened is that his father said he would box his ears, those ears, which of course by the age 30 were beginning to go. And if he improvised, and improvising was his ticket to success, and it sort of, as it were, mutated into his astonishing facility for variation of all kinds. So by the age of 20, here he is in Vienna, and he's doing pretty well. And then his ears start to buzz, and he begins to realize that he can't hear all the notes. So he's under 30 at this point. And this is when he composes the Moonlight Sonata. And people think of the Moonlight Sonata as something very placid and beautiful, because it's got that beautiful beginning, which is now called Moonlight Sonata because a poet said it reminded him of the moonlight on Lake Lucerne. He didn't call it a Moonlight Sonata. He called it a fantasia, and it is actually, a lot of it is full of anguish, and it was written just at the time when his ears were beginning to buzz. He probably had tinnitus as well as whatever was going wrong with the deafness. But if you listen to the Moonlight Sonata, you can hear a kind of fury and agony in it, as well as the serenity. Moonlight Sonata. We make the life we need. The city's bells are muffled. The sky is frozen copper. You still can hear sometimes, still win the improvising contests. A sonata in C sharp minor, quasi fantasia. Like a blind girl lit by moonlight she cannot see. New melodies unfold from tiny seeds. Euphoria, then presto agitato, manic rage. The music of loss, of losing. Bass clef, high treble only once, and in despair. Then the new shocked calm of, is it true? Is this what it sounds like, going deaf? So he had some extraordinary and horrifying experiences with doctors. He kept it very secret because, thank you, because he didn't want anybody to know. It was a very rivalrous place, Vienna. It was the Mecca of the world for music, very competitive, highly competitive. He didn't want anybody to get a whiff of ideas that he could not do that listening that you need to do if you're a musician, that hearing. So he didn't even tell his closest friends. And this went on for about 3 years. But he did go to doctors. And they said it was to do with his stomach. They made him have baths in Danube water, and all sorts of mad things like that. And one doctor did something quite extraordinary. He bound to his upper arms leaves of poisonous leaves on his upper arms like that, all down from his shoulder to his elbow, left them a week, and then took them off. And of course, there were pustules raised. There was huge rashes, very, very painful. And he would lance them. And he said that what came out was all this stuff in his system that was coming out. That was what was blocking his ears. Quite mad. And Beethoven was not a fool. He knew that this was no good, but this was the medicine there was. Then he was experimenting. He was almost going to have, and this would have been awful. There were ears, things poked into his ears, all sorts of stuff about the beginnings of electricity and the magic of electricity. Anyway, the most sensible doctor he consulted said, look, leave Vienna with all these noises in it, go to a peaceful place in the country to rest your ears for a few months. So he went to a little village called Heiligenstadt, which actually means holy state, holy city. And it's now at the end of the tram line in Vienna. It's a suburb, but then it was in the sort of Vienna woods and hills. Lovely place. And there is actually one of the best museums I've ever been to there, which really goes into everything that was happening to Beethoven, what he did. And it's a wonderful museum. Anyway, he took rooms in a little bakery, a little courtyard. And it was May, and he was very hopeful. And this is a poem about him working then. He had just done something which gave him a lot of attention. He had written the music for a ballet, which was a very new art form, really, called The Creatures of Prometheus. An Italian choreographer had commissioned him. It was cutting edge stuff. And his music had been very, very sort of listened to, and it was exciting. He was the avant-garde. And he had, for one of the variations he did in the Creatures of Prometheus, there was one tune that he kept working on. And this, in the end, became one of the tunes in the last movement of the Eroica Symphony. But of course, he didn't know that then. But he was, I think it's important because the Eroica Symphony in 1803, when he came back from this place, was his breakthrough moment. It initiated 10 years of his heroic period, the Eroica, which he called for Napoleon. But I want to keep Prometheus in mind because Prometheus is the great hero between human and divine who steals fire from the gods and gives it to men, human beings, men usually, probably. It's of course the symbol of creativity. It's the beginning of civilization. It's human creativity, but Prometheus suffers for it. It's a stolen gift, stolen from the gods, given to men, but in some sense, men shouldn't have it, and he is punished for it. So this attendant image of pain, the cost of creativity, is there in that music that came from the Creatures of Prometheus and finally became the Eroica Symphony. So here he is in the woods outside Vienna, in the hills, composing away and then walking in the hills every afternoon because he loved nature and walking and gave him ideas. Human fire. You spend mornings composing, tossing away old drafts and crumpled walls, then plunge into veins of forest. The notebook swings in your pocket. Inspiration springs from shadow, thistle chandeliers, red nipples of wild haws. You are Prometheus, the benefactor, stealing flame to give to humans, a Shiva ray creating and destroying. You are defiance, a golden razor, a regatta, Lucifer, falling and flickering with the discipline of firebreak. Melody and rhythm flow from the molten blue of summer hills. But there's a coppery stain on the rising moon. You know creation comes with pain. The stolen gift draws punishment in its wake and ends in the rock, the vulture, and the chain. You stride on through the woods. You believe in freedom, human fire created out of clay. So there's a lot in that poem and in those ideas about his defiance of fate. Right at the end of the story, that as he died, he lifted up his fist, and it may have been just a muscle contraction, but his mythographers said he was defying his fate. Certainly at this point, which is the sort of first real crisis in his life of his ears, there is a sort of sense of defiance. So he stayed in that place through the summer. This is 1802, where we are now. And there was an awful moment when he went for a walk with a friend, and the friend said, "Oh, listen, there's a shepherd must be playing a wooden flute in the woods." And Beethoven couldn't hear it. And his friend immediately saw his face and said, "Oh, no, actually, I can't hear it anymore." He stopped. Beethoven knew he was lying. And he was very quiet after that, and began to realize from that point on, through the summer months, as the summer changed to August and September, that maybe his ears were not going to get better. And on October the 6th, he wrote an extraordinary letter, or sort of letter. It's called the Heilig Testament, because that's where he wrote it. And he never sent it. It was discovered in his little writing desk after he died, long after. And it was ostensibly addressed to his two brothers, whom he did not get on with. But it was also for us, really, for posterity. And he was basically saying, I know, well, I'll read a little bit of it to you. "Oh, you men who think I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly you wrong me. You do not know the secret cause which makes me seem that way. For 6 years, I have been hopelessly afflicted, made worse by senseless physicians, from year to year deceived with hopes of improvement. I must face this is forever, doomed to loneliness, deficient in the one sense which should be more perfect in me than anyone. I would have put an end. Only my art. Impossible to leave the world until I have composed all I feel called to make. So I endure, wretched, until it please the fates to break the thread." So he's saying in this that he contemplated killing himself because of the deafness. It had now gone on for 6 years. He's now 32, or coming up to 32. Until it please the fates to break the thread. 5 full moons, 5 waning moons, touches of chill in the autumn night, dying vine leaves, purple as the pulse vein in his wrist, the woods yellow, then black and bare. The candle trembles in a draught, shutters swing in silence, like the sea breathing through glass. He cannot hear the driving rain. But he is sketching a funeral march, a symphony. I have taken a new path. And this is a really sort of extraordinary and iconic moment in his life, because he at this moment of despair, of suicidal despair, he's beginning a new symphony. This symphony is going to be the Eroica. And here he's composing the funeral march, sketching out the funeral march for the Aroca Symphony, his third symphony. And there's, of course, the Prometheus Variations, which is going to come. So in the midst of this dark descent to the underworld, he is snatching his, the real fire of his own creativity. Eroica. All night I've been thinking of you careening down to the underworld. Now, with the resilience of a dervish, you rage back up from the depths and get a job as composer in a theatre. The man you hoped to be is disappearing into the horizon like a creature of sea ice. But you, a fire dust, gold flight winching upwards into pure light, Napoleon the liberator, conqueror of the Alps. Battles are being won, smashing windows all over the city, making old Vienna and the Habsburg Empire look like a study of life on the ocean floor. While you drive forward into a new world dawn, thrilling with dissonance, calling up wild steel angels no one has met before, looking down on volutes of the foyer as on a dying fire. You are havoc on the brink, a jackhammer shattering the night and soaring past world sorrow. Against everything that can happen to you or anyone, you pitch experiment and the next new key, ever more remote. So he writes the Aroca Symphony and it's a success. And this ushers in the 10 years of his, what's called his heroic period, his, great masterpieces, which are now the staple of concert halls when we get into concert halls again all over the world. I'm just thinking of time. But he is in this city, which he has a very complicated relationship with. And in that Heilig Testament, that letter, he talks about doomed to loneliness. Now, if we talk about love, he was a very lively young man before he went deaf. His friends said he was always in love and usually much affected by the love he was in at the time. And he became very well known in Vienna as a sort of pianist originally. And so countesses sent their daughters to him to learn the piano. It was there was no television. Piano playing was part of a middle class and upper class household. There were some very good pianists among them and very good musicians. It was a highly musical society. And so he met these exquisite 18-year-old countesses. And of course he fell in love. So he fell in love with a lot of countesses, in fact. But, he was a commoner, and countesses couldn't marry commoners. And B, he had no prospects. He was quite short, pockmarked, ugly. The girls thought he was terrific as a piano teacher and somebody to look up to and a musician, but they were always whisked away. And he was, he had enemies as well. He was always restless. He moved constantly. So he must have lived in about 70 different apartments in Vienna. But the apartment he lived in longest and left and came back to was in the ramparts of Vienna. These were the old walls, which were later pulled down in the 19th century to make the Ringstrasse. Those of you who know Vienna, there's a sort of a strasse, a ring around the city. So I thought I wrote a poem when there's another sort of museum of where Beethoven lived in this apartment building. And behind the door, I found this notice, which you'll hear about in this poem, which reminded me of the darkness of Vienna, of the city of Vienna. The shadow behind the door. Ramparts of Vienna, An airy view Beethoven loved. The rooms where he wrote the Archduke Trio and rewrote Fidelio. Nothing gave him such trouble. I once asked a professional singer what it was like singing the first act quartet on stage. She said, "The earth moves if you get it right." On display, a showcase all to itself, the canister that held his salt and pepper, rescued at an auction of his things. Separate lids, delicately hinged for each gilded compartment, like tiny harpsichords, opening side by side. Amazing, this survived. He rarely picked up anything without dropping it. Every domestic item knocked and broken. In shadow, behind the door, a sign says this museum was set up in 1941. Newspapers complained, Jews living in the house of Beethoven. And the family living here was sent to Theresienstadt, then Auschwitz. I think of fallen stones, a Jewish cemetery in forest overgrown by fern, and the story of a cantor's son I heard in Szczecin, Poland. When the Nazis came, his father said, run. He ran the stretch marked out on sports day from the synagogue steps to the forest edge. The only one in town who got away. This sign behind the door is Europe too. We are all Vienna, the beautiful city you cannot trust. We know it now, know it again. Creatures of division, evil and good, blown off course by a bitter wind and lost in a haunted wood. We are the dark, rift in the lute, fault in the bone, the light of enlightenment, driven away by monsters of the heart and fallen feathers in the dirt like warnings. But earth still moves if you get it right. I mean, I was so struck when I was in Vienna. This is the city where psychoanalysis was born. But I felt this, you know, the anti-Semitism, anti-immigrantism, anti-other seeping up from between the pavestones, these beautiful imperial buildings, but also this history of the dark. This I was there in 2018. You know, as far as where I come from in Britain, you know, Brexit had been voted on but not yet implemented. In other parts of Europe, there were, you know, in Hungary, in Poland, there were, you know, more and more alt-right movements, fascist movements. And one of the people, when I went to Vienna, one of the people I met was somebody who, at age 16, she was from Austria. She'd come and help me as an au pair with my daughter, and she was now back there working in a camp for immigrant children. And so it was I was just very struck that along with high civilization does go this under the Minotaur in the labyrinth, as it were. George Steiner's point that, you know, the immense civilizedness of some of the people who implemented the Holocaust. So back to Beethoven. He lived through 2 occupations of the city by French soldiers, by Napoleon, and falling in love, and then his hopes dashed again and again. And then in his early 40s, there was a woman who seems to have returned his love, finally, but he couldn't marry her. We don't know who she was. The woman who was the festival director of the Bonn Beethoven Festival, which should have happened last year for Beethoven's 250th anniversary of his birth, said, thank goodness we don't know who she was. Nobody, there are books have been written, a whole shelf load of books have been written about who the immortal beloved was. The phrase comes from another letter he wrote to a woman, again on the 6th of a month, but this was the 6th of July, 1812. And he wrote it from a spa town, having been in apparently Prague, and where he presumably had spent the night with this woman. And again, I'm going to read you a little bit of it. And this letter, which was again never sent, was found with the Heilig Testament in his writing desk when he died. So it was never sent. Never can another own my heart. Never, never. Oh God, why have to separate oneself from what one loves? My life in Vienna is a miserable life. Your love makes me at once the happiest and most unhappy. Only through quiet contemplation can we reach our goal to live together. Be patient, love me. What longing with tears for you, my love, my all, farewell. So that is the part of the emotion, the immortal beloved letter. Of course, he doesn't mention her name. Forever yours, forever mine, forever us. Sometimes giving up what you love leads on to everything you wanted in your life. But that doesn't mean it was not loss. What remains is an echo, an afterglow from a night with a woman he loves. Maybe the only night he ever spent with anyone. A letter from a man who broke down on a midnight dash through a forest. He was warned. He ignored the warning. He always does. A letter he maybe never sent and nobody saw until he died and it was found in a secret drawer. A promise of eternal togetherness. A wishbone about to break. A letter of goodbye from a man aching to be touched. Walking away from what means most to him, except his art. Who wrote long after to his publisher, farewell is said only from the heart and when you are alone. So I haven't got time for many more. What I did with this book was that I put notes to the poems, sort of historical notes, which turned into a little sort of historical mini bio, and I put it all at the back so that you can read that along with all the sort of music that he did in turn, so you can see where it fits into his life in the back in prose, so that these are just poems. And I'm just going to read the last one, which is really about the autopsy. He asked for an autopsy to be done because he wanted to know, of course he couldn't know, but he wanted it to be known what was the cause of his deafness. And then, of course, that's never been solved, but this comes out of the autopsy. Musica humana. The auditory canal covered in glutinous scales, shining throughout the autopsy. The auditory arteries, thick and cartilaginous as if stretched over a raven's quill. And the auditory nerve withered to a pure white strand. But reading the last page in the book of his life on earth, how he joked to the doctor who lanced his belly, gallons of fluid gushing out across the floor, "You remind me of Moses striking the rock with his staff." How he laughed when he could. How he read and reread with great joy, he said, a final gift, a 40-volume set of all the works of Handel. And how he died, lifting his fist as if it held a bird he would release into the storm, pelting Vienna with snow, like the reckless feathers driving all our lives to seek the fullest experience of the air. I listen to Cello Sonata, Opus 69, and hear the unquenchable spirit that powers every note he writes and lives on, dancing, dancing in you, me, everyone. So that's all I've got time for, but I'm very happy to answer questions in the time that remains.
Wow, thank you so much. This was fantastic. brilliant, fantastic, and we learn so much without feeling that we are learning.
That's nice.
I
That's
mean,
really nice.
it's amazing. It's amazing how you integrate biography with poetry and science as well. So without being informative in the sense, in the scientific sense. So it's brilliant. Thank you so much. And we're going to open the floor right now for questions and comments. So if you would like to ask the poet a question, please write it down in the chat box, and then we might invite you to speak through the microphone if you feel like it. Okay, we have a comment from David Crosby. Thank you so much. This was an amazing way to splice a lecture and reading. Ahmed Sharafuddin, what triggers the ideas for the topics of your poetry? Is it occasions, people, or places?
Well, it might be anything. And with these, it was very much often the music itself. I was listening to the music a lot. I mean, I knew it from playing it, but also reading his life, and also the places. You're right. I mean, it's ideas, people, and places. So that being in Vienna was very important to me. Being in the place where he wrote a lot of things, where he suffered a lot of the things, where he decided not to commit suicide. And I suppose the deepest empathy for trying to open myself to what he was feeling. And I think a lot of poems come from that, really, about feeling out from not just yourself, but into the world.
Right, right. Thank you. We also have a comment from Sheikha Al-Khamili. Thank you so much. It was really great. We have a question from Dr. Omar Sabah. This was both fascinating and deeply enjoyable. I would like to ask a question, make a comment about music and poetry. Dr. Sabah, you may unmute if you wish to.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Professor Padel. That was really, really enjoyable and fascinating, as I said. I have a question or a comment / question, which I think might be pertinent because some lines, I mean, obviously when you're listening to poetry, you don't have as much permanence as you do on the page, but some lines really struck me as beautifully woven in. So a line like, "We make the music we need," captures for me the very nature of variations because it's got the creative and the static, the given. And that's, I think, comes across throughout with the Prometheus, with the suspension falling into the real world and so on. This movement between stop-start, the reinventing of the self, like in poetry, I presume, I know, well, I think I know in poetry, but less so in music, is that central? Because I noticed in some of your poems, they're not wholly linear. You know, there's a stop-start that adds to the overall linearity in a meta sense, which gives tonality and so on. Is that important, the reinvention, the restlessness?
That's a really, really interesting way of putting it. Yes, it's I suppose, I mean, I wrote a book once which was about reading poetry, and I called it The Poem and the Journey. And in that, I went into the journey of a poem. I mean, poetry is movement, like music is movement. And you know, right the way back in the 5th century BC, you know, you had the idea of a foot of music. So you are traveling on your feet through the musical journey. But journeys can be in so many different sorts of lines. They can be circular, it can be a spiral journey, it can return on itself in a ring, or it can go out into the horizon and never come back again. It can be a return. So I think, and I think thought is like that too. Thought can return to something or go forward or come back in a different form, and all those are variations. But I love your idea of restlessness, I think, and that is also to do with the reinvention of the self, as you say, the self at different moments. So I suppose it's a kind of auditory, an auditory discovering of the self. Lovely idea.
Wow, thank you. That was an interesting question and answer. Maria Donovan, author Maria Donovan, who will be having her session tomorrow, comments by saying, "Thank you. I so enjoyed the combination of your poetry with learning such fascinating things about Beethoven."
Thank you.
We also have a comment and question by Khadija Al-Rabti. Khadija says it was marvelous, and she has a quick question. Khadija, I will invite you to use the mic if you wish to.
Yes, hello, thank you so much, Professor. It really was marvellous. And I think one part that really stuck with me is when you said women do their music making away from home. And I know everyone interprets poetry differently, but I was really interested to know what that meant for you in particular.
Yes, well, what that meant for me as a child was that my father was the one who had a lot of professional musicians in his family. He played quartets at home. There was always quartet playing and so on. And we all played stringed instruments. My mother was the odd one out. She was a clarinetist and she was a pianist, but she didn't do very much of it because she was so busy, raising us. So she went and sang in choirs outside the home, or she played in orchestras outside the home. It's very different. Everybody experiences music differently and music making differently. And I feel rather sorry for her that she couldn't enjoy more music making in the home. And what I didn't put into my presentation was singing, actually. What was very important to me privately was singing. And I had a wonderful piano teacher for just a few years called Olive Lewin from Jamaica. She was the first Black student, I think, in the Guildhall in London in the late 40s. And then she was working as a concert pianist for a while. And I was lucky enough to be taught by her when I was young for a few years. And then she went back to Jamaica and she became a famous ethnomusicologist, discovering Jamaican folk music and archiving it. And I think that's why I called this session, What Songs Do You Sing? And that goes back to your question, because I think women's songs are so important. So my mother did sing to me a lot when she was young, and I have always carried that with me as a sort of, this is my private thing. I wasn't drilled in singing. I didn't have to hold the viola properly or hold my hands properly or anything like that. It was just something I did naturally, and I can take it anywhere. And actually in lockdown, it's been really important to me. I'm now learning raga singing, in Indian singing. So that's a lovely question. Thank you. It's the privacy and the naturalness that I'm thinking about.
Thank you so much.
Lovely. We have a comment from Clive Roberts who says, truly inspirational, thank you. And a question from Mariam Al-Bastaki, who asks, did you ever consider writing about different composers?
Oh, it was going to be about Schubert as well, because I would love to write about Schubert. And in fact, I was going to call the book The Divine Spark, because, and I looked at Schubert's birthplace and everything as well in Vienna, because he idolized Beethoven, but he only survived. He was sort of 20 years later, 25 years younger, but he only survived one more year than Beethoven. He died at 31, Beethoven died at 56. But he did somebody gave him, it's reported, somebody gave him Beethoven as he was dying, the manuscripts of Schubert, and he said this man has a divine spark. Whether that's true, we don't know. But Schubert's songs are so important to me, and I learned to sing on the piano Schubert's songs, and his life is just so tragic, but his music is so heartrending. So yes, Schubert. I don't know if I will do this, but I would love to.
That would be very interesting. And we have a question by Dr. Alan Hickman. Do you have a favorite depiction of Beethoven on film?
No. I did look at various different things, but no, I haven't. It's interesting about him visually that because he was famous in his lifetime, a lot of people painted him. And they're astonishingly different. In fact, I include black and white pictures of 4 of them in the book, because it's very sort of, his last ones are so sort of miserable looking, and he was romanticized and idealized, and he became the great romantic hero. He is in a sense the first romantic composer and the first romantic musical hero, but I don't think don't think I can capture that on film. Have you got? I just want to know. Do you have any favorite images of him on film?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Gary Oldman. I always think of him in Immortal Beloved, but
Yeah.
I saw a film once called Beethoven's Nephew. Have you seen that one? Paul Morrison.
No.
And the man who played Beethoven was just, Beethoven to the life. So
Okay. Oh, well, I'd like to see that. I left out the whole story of the nephew because it's so painful and it's such a complicated story that I didn't have time.
It's very strange.
Yeah. Very sad as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'll look that up.
Okay, Dr. Gail Hamill comments, thank you, love your poetry. Want to return to it and Beethoven both. Ahmed Sharafuddin comments, I heard about Beethoven's struggles before, but today we felt them vividly through your poetry. Thanks for sharing.
Thanks so much.
Leah has a comment as well. This was great. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. And Lorenzo Caligaris has a question. You mentioned the concept of creativity coming at a cost when you mentioned the myth of Prometheus. Would you say that this is something that applies to your life as much as it does to Beethoven's? Or more in general, do you believe that creativity never comes freely to artists?
That's a very interesting idea. I think it may be the other way round, that it's a natural thing when you are in pain. Not necessarily physical pain, but in dark times of your life, it's very common to want to express it in poetry or in music. I mean, poets know this particularly, that you need poetry at various points in your life, like, for example, when your mother dies, or moments of great joy, but particularly in funerals. And we are always being asked, poets are always being asked for poems for funerals. And I think, and it is true that at moments of great intensity, that's when you compose most vividly, or write most vividly. So I think it's sort of the other way around, that moments of enormous intensity tend to trigger creativity. But also creativity, it does have a cost, all sorts of different sorts of cost. You choose to be alone rather than go out to see your friends, or, go downstairs to see your family for the family dinner because you're writing a sonata, something like that, or a poem. So there are different levels of cost, I think. But certainly human creativity, like Prometheus's or Beethoven's, does come out of pain, as well as all the other gifts.
Right, thank you. And speaking of poetry and funerals, I'd like to take a moment to tell everyone about your book, Emerald, which is a beautiful, beautiful celebration of your mother's life.
Thank you.
And at the very start of lockdown, which was early March last year, so it was exactly a year ago, my grandmother passed away and I couldn't travel to attend her funeral. And this book really kept me going. And as you mentioned, that, it does spark creativity, or there's this need during intense emotional moments that, we want to write and we want to express ourselves.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I mean, I'm so sorry about your grandmother and that you couldn't travel, because it's so important to be with people.
Exactly. Yeah, I know. It was just so unfortunate, but at the same time, I mean, it was a very reflective period where I was, thinking of our memories together, just writing about it. And Emerald did a great job at keeping me going.
That's a wonderful thing to say. Thank you so much.
And does anyone else have any questions? Ahmad, I saw your hand up, or no?
Yeah, I was going to mention one thing about this last point, if I can. I like everyone else, when I'm in pain, in spiritual, psychological, I don't think physical. I've ever written poetry from physical pain, but no, I understand that completely. And we all want to kind of bear witness, I suppose. It's almost like a prayer in a way when we write out of pain, because we want someone to sort of know and see what's happening. But I was going to ask, you know, obviously Beethoven is Beethoven, you know, without knowing much about music, I know he's a genius. But would you say that music and poetry are, when they are, you know, reactions to pain, they can transcend a mere therapy, I would hope anyway, because I don't think just the therapeutic thing is enough to make a really good artifact. You know, there has to be some sort of, you know, mediating point, doesn't there? I mean, I'm just, yeah.
And it takes you out of the grief or the pain into the technicalities as well, into how do you relate one note to another to express this.
Right, yeah. Because
yeah,
that's what I picked up on you on what I loved about some of your poems at the beginning, especially, was that you went between different kind of, there was elements of counterfactual, elements of memory, elements of description. They all kind of, they had this kind of moving texture together. It wasn't just one seamless kind of tale, you know, because that's not what life's like, as you said earlier. It's kind of, it is made of a jumble of different ways of being, you know. So no, yeah, I just want to mention that.
I think you sound like an ideal reader. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Padel, and thank you very much. Also, I want to thank the audience for being here. And I also want to happily announce that Professor Padel will also be back with us again on the 31st of March for the grand finale. So we will be opening the festival with you and closing it with you as well. Thank you so much for this beautiful evening. And I don't know if there's anything else that you would like to read or say to close the session.
Well, I'll read the last little bit of one of the poems here, which is for when he nearly died, and this is about a wonderful movement, the slow movement of one of his late quartets 132, and the poem is called In the Lydian Mode. Mm-hmm. And it's a very calm movement, which is, you know, has been used as by Aldous Huxley in the novel Point Counterpoint as proof of the existence of God. Quiet as a wreath of sleep for anyone in sorrow, the slow unfold at last of a promise that everything will be laid to rest, every falling cadence in its place. A holy city, a halo of gold leaf, saying, tomorrow is a mystery. Today is a gift from God. Without the dark, we'd never see the stars. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much. This was beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you on the 31st.
See you on the 31st. Right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.